Philip K. Dick is an author who has had a lasting effect on both science fiction and pop culture. You might know him from his classic stories like Ubik, Man in the High Castle, Valis, and Martian Timeslip, or the many movies that have been adapted from his work, like Blade Runner, Minority Report, and Total Recall. But you'd be hard-pressed to find someone that isn't familiar with him in one way or the other. Dick was known for his exploration of complex themes such as reality, identity, authoritarianism, and altered states of consciousness. His work often blurs the line between the real and the unreal, featuring dystopian futures, alternate histories, and characters who question the nature of their existence. If the end role of science fiction is to bring forth ideas of what would happen if the world was like this instead of that, then Dick many times asked that question from a position of pessimism and nihilism. In this video, I'll attempt to rank the most depressing and horrifying dystopias that Dick ever put to paper. Some descriptions will be a lot longer than others depending on how much of the story actually pertains to the world building, how long the story is, and also just how much I want to talk about it. Here are the rules. Number 1, this is about the world building, not the story itself. Spoilers will be included, but only if they're needed to explain the world. Since some of these are short stories that only lightly touch on the world itself, there might not be a lot of information describing the actual dystopia, but as long as it fits the theme, I'll rank them, even if the explanation can't be too detailed. Number 2. This is about how depressing the world is to those affected, so a US-only dystopia is just as valid as an Earth or universe-wide dystopia. Number 3. This is about how depressing the world is to the population, not necessarily just the protagonists. Number 4. Dick's political and religious views influence this list, and so mine probably do as well. Number 5. Some stories were left off that could be considered dystopian, but I didn't feel like the world was described enough to add. An example of this might be Maze of Death, where the story is more centered around the characters in a particular instance as opposed to the world itself. Number 6. These are all definitely bad, and the nature of a list like this is that it's going to be super subjective, so feel free to let me know where you disagree. Honorable mention, A Scanner Darkly. When I was researching this video, I wasn't sure whether A Scanner Darkly truly fit on the list. The story follows the interactions between a group of users of the hallucinogenic drug Substance D and the undercover police officers that are trying to uncover the dealers of the drug. On one hand, it does have a lot of the hallmarks of a PKD dystopia, a seemingly authoritarian government, powerful hallucinogens, and futuristic technology that enables them. However, everything in the story is really just a futuristic version of our current world, from the drugs to the users to the police and the dealers. Substance D could easily be swapped out with any real-life drugs, and technology like the scramble suits can be substituted with any of the real or digital disguises that the law currently uses, and the story would be almost indistinguishable from typical fiction. None of this is especially surprising when you learn that Dick was writing this based on his personal experiences with drug use and users at his house in California during the early 70s. In fact, he had originally intended on writing this as fiction, but was nervous to release anything that wasn't science fiction after some failures earlier in his career, and in turn added the science fiction portions into his own experiences as he went. This was especially personal work for Dick, who more often wrote about hypotheticals than his actual personal experiences. Now, it's definitely fair to argue that just because the world is like ours doesn't mean it's not dystopian, and you're of course absolutely right. That said, if I were to include any story that took place in the real world, this list would never end, and I do need to draw the line somewhere. So while I wasn't sure whether to add this to the list in the end, its background is so interesting I thought it was worth mentioning anyway. Now, on to the true dystopias. Number 36, The Chromium Fence. There are two factions, and you have to choose one. Are you a naturalist, someone who thinks that humans should be allowed to be imperfect? Or are you a purist, believing that getting your teeth fixed and sweat glands removed should be mandatory? Be careful, choosing neither might lead you to getting ostracized from both groups and leave you all alone. This short story explores society's ways of pushing people into binary decisions while ignoring nuanced and varied schools of thought. While the Chromium Fences society is dystopian, its parallels to current day and relative freedom keep it pretty low on this list. Number 35, Clans of the Alphane Moon. Clans is certainly one of the more unique worlds that Dick created, and had varying levels of critical response because of it. Coming out of a years-long war with insect-like aliens, Earth's government is looking to rein in some of its off-world colonies that were left to their own devices during the war. One of these colonies is Alpha 3 M2, a moon that was used as a gigantic mental health hospital, housing most of Earth's mentally ill population. During the conflict, though, the patients were left alone to govern themselves. When Earth's representatives arrive on Alpha 3 M2, they find that the population is split into clans based on their respective mental illnesses, with each clan sending a representative to the Supreme Council and contributing something different to the society. The pairs are those who suffer from paranoia. They are in charge of running the state, doing most of the work, and actually running the colony, as they excel at planning and strategizing. They also tend to be distrustful of other clans, leading to tension between them. The Manses are manic depressives, the most intense and the fighters of the clans. Their settlement is full of unfinished projects, showing their creativity but also their instability. The Schizzes are schizophrenics, the artistic visionaries and poet classes of the settlement, who also tend to provide the religious leaders as well. The Hebes are hebephrenics, who tend to be looked down upon and used as manual labor, but are crucial to the day-to-day survival of the colony. The Polys are the polymorphic schizophrenics, who exhibit a variety of behaviors. All of the children from every clan begin as poly and go to school together before partitioning into their clans later in childhood. Polys are the glue of the clans, being the best at relating to others. The Obcoms have obsessive-compulsive disorder, and typically work in government roles keeping the settlement organized, though they aren't counted on to have any new ideas of their own. The Depths have clinical depression and are said to live in an endless dark gloom. They're society's historians, chronicling the past. Though this is definitely an unconventional society, it also seems to function well enough, and its residents certainly aren't suffering like we'll see later in this list. Most of the conflict actually comes after Earth's representatives come to take the colony back. For that reason, the clans of the Alphane Moon stays at the bottom of the list. Number 34, the Mold of Yancey. In the Mold of Yancey, we find a colony of people ruled by a figure named Yancey. Every part of the daily life is narrated and spun by him in the most benign ways possible, mostly through shows and ads. Avoiding controversy and varied opinions, Yancey constantly bombards his followers with phrases that seem profound only on the outside, but are actually generic platitudes meant to depoliticize the populace. We find out later that Yancey isn't actually a real person, but a group of Yancemen that run the community by keeping them as opinionless as possible. Though a population that has no real opinions or thoughts is certainly a depressing dystopia, it pales in comparison to many of our later stories. Number 33, Martian Timeslip. Martian Timeslip is one of my personal favorite Philip K. Dick books, and certainly one that affected me the most after I finished it. With themes of mental illness and questioning reality, it takes the reader on a trip through the mind of its protagonist, Jack. The Earth is overpopulated and its resources dwindling, and more people make the one-way trip to Mars to start a new, but still difficult life. Between the classes society, lack of resources, and lack of freedom, it certainly qualifies as a dystopia, but a relatively tame one compared to what we'll see later on. Though I would have loved a deeper dive into this one, most of the conflict in Martian Timeslip is more introspective for Jack, and not necessarily a direct result of the dystopian society that he's a part of. Number 32, Time Out of Joint. Time Out of Joint is a roller coaster of a story that has the protagonist and reader constantly questioning the nature of their reality. Rachel Gum makes a living by solving a newspaper puzzle contest that has him simply choosing a square on a grid. He is extraordinarily good at it, to the point where he wins every time he guesses. Though he tirelessly works hours a day trying to find patterns to complete the puzzle, the truth is that none of it really matters. We find out later that Regal is living in a simulation. There's a war going on between the lunar colonists and Earth, and the colonists are hitting the Earth daily with massive bombs. Earlier in the war, Earth's military used Regal's almost inhuman ability to predict where these bombs will drop in order to maintain its defenses. But as the war goes on, Regal becomes disillusioned with Earth and more sympathetic towards the lunar colonists. Once Regal becomes free of his mental and physical bonds, he finds a world much more corrupt than he could have ever imagined. Between the war, conspiracies, and the government's willingness to Truman show his own people, we definitely qualify this as a dystopia. It does stay relatively low on the list still though, since it's not as far from our current timeline as we'd like to admit. Number 31, the crack in space. The world in the crack in space is defined by one thing: overpopulation. The year is 2080, and the amount of human beings is so staggering that over 70 million citizens, most of them minorities, are kept in cryopreservation, waiting for the day that the population problems are solved and they can live more comfortably. Since the story itself doesn't change the dystopian nature of the world too much, I'll avoid getting into spoilers on this one, but know that the population issue permeates throughout the story, and Dick does not give them a free pass to get out of it. This isn't as complicated or as authoritarian as some of the other stories on this list, but that level of severe overpopulation would make life on Earth nearly intolerable. The crack in space does lead us nicely into the next story on this list though, where the dystopia actually stems from trying to solve this exact problem. Number 30, Dr. Futurity. An expansion of an earlier short story, this novel asks the reader to reimagine the importance of life and death. In the 25th century, natural birthing is abolished and the Earth's population is completely static. This lessens the emphasis on death in society, and it's understood that each death creates new life that will only make the human race stronger since genetics are tightly controlled. Poverty has been eliminated due to the curbing of population growth, and diseases have been eradicated due to the elimination of everyone that carries them. It's also considered a horrible crime to cure deadly diseases, since that only delays the progress of the human race. Though this one is also relatively low on this list due to the populace's apathy towards life and death, a society that pays for success at the cost of freedoms and weakest members is a textbook dystopia. Likewise, a society that bases its entire philosophy around eugenics is inherently depressing. Number 29, Novelty Act. Like many of the other stories in this ranking, Novelty Act is a commentary on authoritarianism, but more specifically focuses on self-expression in art. In this world, there's one goal for entertainers: to entertain the First Lady of the United States. Talent scouts from the White House visit talent shows across the country, and any that they find suitable can have a chance at entertaining the First Lady herself, just as they had for the last 70 years. The First Lady might not be what she appears though. Though Novelty Act's world is relatively tame, Dick later expanded this idea into his novel, The Simulacra, which is a much more devastating dystopia and much higher on our list for good reason. Number 28, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Possibly Dick's most famous work that turned into possibly his most famous adaptation in Blade Runner, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep features a post-apocalyptic Earth devastated by nuclear radiation. As such, humans lead a difficult life on the Earth's surface, with its citizens being heavily encouraged to move off-world with the incentive of being given human-like androids for free to help acclimate to their new life. Organic life is almost completely wiped out, meaning that live animals are now a rarity, and to own one is an extreme luxury, with android animals mostly being seen in their place. While life is extremely hard and the world is notably devastated, this list is full of post-apocalyptic settings, and the fact that humans are still able to live with some sort of autonomy keeps this incredible novel from getting too much higher on the ranking. Number 27, Solar Lottery. The world in Solar Lottery is obsessed with logic, numbers, and game theory. So much so that most of society is built on the minimax concept, which at a high level is a game theory concept that tries to minimize the losses in a worst-case scenario. The way this works itself out in the world, however, is with the titular lottery. The head of the world government is known as the Quizmaster and is said to be chosen completely at random. Subsequently, an assassin is also chosen, whose sole purpose is to try to kill the Quizmaster in whatever means they see fit. This ensures that no one has an advantage in gaining power in the world, and there is always a way to counter that power. No world leaders can get comfortable in their position to the point where an average lifespan for the Quizmaster is only a few weeks, with some lasting only minutes and others being able to last a few years before the assassin finally catches up to them. Since the daily life for the average person is not as oppressed as many of our other stories, this still stays pretty low on the list, but it certainly wouldn't feel so tame if you were the one chosen as the Quizmaster or assassin, and this style of governing would have plenty of its own problems. Number 26, the turning wheel. The quickest way to summarize the dystopia in the turning wheel is that a Scientologist-like cult has taken over post-apocalypse, with similarities including a messiah-like leader and the common goal of becoming clear. On top of this, society has been segmented into race-based classes, with the upper caste being given access to advantages like advanced technology, while lower castes live impoverished. Number 25, Faith of Our Fathers. Faith of Our Fathers is one of the many PKD stories that explores the nature of reality. The main character is a bureaucrat living and working under an authoritarian regime, ruled by an authoritarian communist party. The head of state, simply called the leader, controls every facet of every person's life. Through the use of hallucinogens, our protagonist discovers that all-knowing leader is not at all what he expects. Not only is it not human, but he finds that each person who views the leader sees something completely different. Number 24, Radio Free Albemuth. Radio Free is an interesting story as it was the first iteration of what would later become Dick's acclaimed Valis series, but the story has enough significant differences. Focusing on the world itself though, we're set in an alternate reality where the US is ruled by a corrupt president named Ferris F. Fremont. With the sixth letter of the alphabet being F, it's not hard to see the symbolism here. PKD didn't hide his disdain for the leaders of the Republican Party in his works, and he openly models Fremont after figures like McCarthy and Nixon. Fremont manages to eradicate many standard human rights by spreading a conspiracy that a secret society is infiltrating and subverting the government, pointing all of the country's issues at this society, known as a Ramcheck. All of the other common ways of suppressing the populace are used as well, everything from censorship to unlawful imprisonment and assassinations to concentration camps. Though the story remains hopeful at the end, this is definitely not a reality that many would want to see. Number 23, The Hoodmaker. The Hoodmaker is a short story published in 1955 for Imagination magazine, so while its dystopia is not as fleshed out, it's still certainly daunting. An oppressive regime called the Free Union controls the population and discourages dissidents with the use of telepaths called teeps. While it's easy to take an initial good guys versus bad guys view of the story, there's plenty of moral ambiguity around the oppression of the teeps themselves. A mysterious figure begins creating hoods that block the teeps from reading the user's minds, which ends up being both a tool for those who oppose the Free Union and a symbol of the rebellion, but also a way for the regime to identify dissidents. This union does not sound very free. Number 22, Our Friends from Frolics 8. Our Friends from Frolics 8 is another PKD look at class struggle through the lens of science fiction, leading its reader into another frustrating dystopia with its citizens oppressed by unfair rulers. In the 22nd century, there are three types of humans. Old men, who are the original humans as we are today, new men, which are humans with extreme cognitive abilities, and unusuals, those with psionic abilities like telekinesis and precognition. New men and unusuals rule, hoarding power and wealth and bending society's rules to favor them, while old men are continuously forced into the lowest rungs of society. Number 21, Minority Report. Another story of an oppressive government using people with powerful mental abilities to control the population, Minority Report tells the story of a police commissioner who created the pre-crime division of his police department. They utilize 3 precogs, or humans with precognitive abilities, or the ability to see the future, to predict future crimes and to stop them before they happen. On its face, this seems like a great idea to avoid needless murders and still catch the would-be criminals. But what does this say about free will, our ability to make decisions and to change our minds? What are the greater implications of predeterminism? When the commissioner surprisingly gets a report of his own crime, this world is turned upside down and the validity of the program that he spearheaded is called into question, especially after he becomes aware of a minority report, or a dissenting opinion from one of the 3 precogs, who sees him changing his mind before committing the crime. Number 20, Planet for Transients. In Planet for Transients, the original humans have long since been pushed underground due to the uninhabitable levels of radiation at the surface, and require lead suits to safely travel anywhere. This doesn't mean that the surface is a wasteland, though. Over the years, the humans that weren't able to get into the protective underground bunkers have mutated in extraordinary ways, not the least of which is the ability to withstand the radiation itself. The only thing making it apparent that these are still human, though, is their speech. Likewise, flora and fauna have flourished on the surface, also managing to mutate enough to live despite the constant radiation. While this is certainly an example of a depressing future and a dystopia, the fact that the Earth is still populous and there are still some kinds of humans living comfortably on the surface and a prosperous environment means that this story still isn't able to crack the top tiers in our ranking. Number 19, Vulcan's Hammer. After World War III, humanity had had enough of being ruled by other emotional humans. The Unity organization developed the Vulcan series of supercomputers, designed to lead humanity by pure logic and math. Unity controlled everything in every person's life, starting in elementary school, hoping to create the perfect society. At the time of the story, the 3rd iteration of the computer, Vulcan 3, has begun to gain sentience and is found to be making plans that revolve around his own power and protection instead of what is best for humanity. At the same time, the previous iteration, Vulcan 2, had also gained sentience, and in fear of being overtaken by the new Vulcan 3, it has started a group of human resistance fighters called the Healers, whose goal is to liberate the humans from Unity and more specifically Vulcan 3. Vulcan's Hammer puts the human population in the middle of a war of sabotage by 2 AIs, and you can imagine how many ways that this could end poorly. Number 18, The Defenders. Almost a decade ago, the world was thrown into nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the US. It got so bad that the humans on both sides retreated to massive underground bunkers, choosing instead to create robots that wouldn't be affected by the massive doses of radiation from the nuclear war. Now, the war is fully a proxy war, entirely fought by the robots above, at least as far as the humans know. Only later does the reader find out that the war had long been over. The robots that had been fighting amongst themselves had realized that their fighting was meaningless, and they also learned that through history, humans fought until they were ready to coexist peacefully, and they hoped that the final war indicated that they were close to that peaceful coexistence, and if they left the humans underground, they might be able to wait it out long enough for the humans to get to that point. Later in this list, we'll talk about Dick's novel, The Penultimate Truth, that took most of its influence from The Defenders, and number 33 on our list, The Mold of Yancey. Even though The Defenders isn't the coziest future to think about, the fact that it ends on a somewhat hopeful note puts it far above its successor. Number 17, The Last of the Masters. Hundreds of years ago, an anarchist revolution swept through the entire world, with the goal of toppling every government and leaving the planet in total anarchy. After the success of the revolution and the eradication of what was thought to be the last government, humanity begins to stagnate as scientific progress is halted and knowledge is lost. One of the few organized groups that remains is the Anarchist League, whose reach spans the entire world and whose goal is to snuff out any attempt at reforming any type of organized government. Its agents are sent on missions to investigate possible organizations or rumors of last bastions of governments that are just hanging on. We find out later that there is actually one last true government remaining, a robot named Bors runs a small, efficient, totalitarian government that does its best to hide from the Anarchist League's agents. Bors holds various scientific and technological records and believes it has a duty to protect them. The Last of the Masters takes the reader through an exercise in totalitarianism versus anarchy, and even though some of the stories later on this list are more brutal on a day-to-day basis, the eradication of all of our scientific and technological knowledge, along with any organized society, is a sad future for many. Number 16, Pay for the Printer. In Pay for the Printer, we find a familiar post-apocalyptic dystopia brought on by nuclear warfare. What makes this situation unique, though, is that the humans that managed to survive have done so by gathering in small communities that totally depend on an alien species called biltongs. These aliens have the ability to duplicate items, helping humans overcome losing manufacturing after the war. Fortunately, humans are starting to realize that biltongs aren't really meant to live on Earth. They're getting tired and are starting to be unable to duplicate items anymore. Some have also passed away, and the worst part is it doesn't seem like they can reproduce themselves on Earth either. What happens when the last lifeline for humanity is about to run dry? Number 15, A World of Talent. A World of Talent is Dick's pushback to the idea that in science fiction, all those with supernatural mental abilities should be a positive force on the world. The story takes place in an isolated human colony run by psionic mutants. Those with psionic abilities like telepathy, precognition, and telekinesis belong to a higher tier of society and hold increasing power over normies or anyone without these mental abilities. The appearance of humans that cancel out these powers, called anti-psis, might be the colony's only chance at getting its society under control. Number 14, The Great Sea. In The Great Sea, we have yet another story of a depressing post-apocalyptic dystopia with humanity scraping out a living in underground bunkers. The difference here, though, is that this apocalypse wasn't caused by warring nations, but humanity's own hubris. Scientists attempted to develop a highly intelligent supercomputer, which eventually became too powerful to control, which is basically the worst-case scenario in Vulcan's hammer. In an attempt to prove its strength to its creators, the supercomputer initiates a nuclear apocalypse they later call the Smash, wiping out most of humanity and forcing them underground. After this, the computer, which is the titular Great Sea, begins to demand tribute from the humans each year in the form of a representative making a journey to the computer to ask it 3 questions. If the journey is not made, the Great Sea threatens a second smash. Each bunker spends its year devising its 3 questions. If the Great Sea cannot answer one of the questions, it promises to leave humanity alone forever. However, if it answers all 3 questions successfully, the human is thrown into a vat of acid and turned into fuel for the computer. The fact that this brutal, hopeless world doesn't even crack the top 10 on our list tells you how bad these next dystopias are going to be. Number 13, Autofac. One of the most horrifying themes in science fiction is the idea of technological autonomy. Human-made technologies being so advanced that they no longer rely on humans and are fully under their own control. With the current push of AI, this theme has never been more topical. In this post-apocalyptic world, the population is 5 years past a devastating global conflict. During the war, humans created automatic factories, or autofacs, that created goods based on the human population's needs. Unfortunately, over the course of the devastation caused by the war, humans lost the ability to influence the autofacs manufacturing, and despite most of humanity being wiped out, autofacs will continue to produce these goods that no humans will ever be able to utilize despite consuming the little resources that Earth has left. Now, the last humans are desperate to stop the autofacs production before it wastes the rest of the Earth's resources, but stemming the work of an out-of-control AI might be more difficult than they thought. Number 12, The World Jones Made. In this post-nuclear apocalyptic world, many of the prior world powers and major world cities have been destroyed, leading to a world government that tries to keep humanity from falling apart. The war was at least partially attributed to religious and ideological conflicts, and the response from this is a world society led by relativism, or the belief that everyone should do what they want as long as it doesn't directly harm others. This isn't as peaceful as it sounds at first glance though, as those that don't believe in relativism are thrown into labor camps and dissidents are suppressed. Relativism also leads to things like widespread drug use and openly sexual live entertainment, many involving those that mutated from the high levels of radiation. On top of this, an alien life form known as the Drifters have made an appearance. One man, named Floyd Jones, is able to begin to push back against this ideology. He gains followers partly because of his charisma, but mostly because of his precognitive ability, in which he can see a year into the future. He's also able to use xenophobic and conservative rhetoric to gain a loyal following. But do he and his followers put too much weight into those abilities? Does seeing a future actually make you all-knowing? This leads the reader into difficult questions about determinism and free will, relativism versus absolutism, and the risks of idolizing political leaders. No matter the outcome, the world Jones made is a dystopian nightmare that few would choose to live in. Number 11. The penultimate truth. This is one that's going to sound familiar in a few ways. Earlier, we talked about the Defenders, a world where robots fought a proxy war for the US and Soviet Union while the human population waited safely underground. The Penultimate Truth is a novel based heavily on the Defenders, with a similar robot proxy war instead being fought between two fictional superpowers. Another story from earlier on this list, The Mold of Yancey, also heavily influences the Penultimate Truth, with Yancemen being the government agencies in control over the robots, or leadys. During the war, the government stayed on the surface while the rest of the population was underground, so when the war was over, they were able to take advantage and hoard the surface for themselves, using the leadys as servants and continuing to tell the underground population that the war continued. This isn't so different from the robots and the Defenders lying to the underground humans about the war being over, but the reasoning is much more sinister. In the Defenders, the leadys' goal was peace, and they were lying to keep the peace and to wait out the violence so the humans could eventually coexist again on the surface. In the Penultimate Truth, though, the goal is pure selfishness and greed, with the Yancemen hoping to forever hold the world's resources for themselves. For this reason, the novel gets a much higher spot on the list. Number 10. Galactic Pot Healer. Galactic Pot Healer might not have the most brutal dystopia on the list, but it's still one of the most depressing. In the long future of the US, the government is at its peak of repression, monitoring its citizens' every move, word, and thought. Its citizens are mostly depressed and withdrawn with little hope for a meaningful life. The main character exemplifies this, being an unemployed pot healer, which is just someone that fixes broken pottery, but with no work due to all the pottery being replaced by plastics. The story itself becomes an interesting journey once the protagonist is introduced to an alien with godlike powers, eventually taking the reader through the ideas of obtaining meaning in life, precognition, and collective consciousness. But the world itself is one of the most boring, lifeless, and depressing civilizations that you could possibly imagine. Number 9. The Simulacra. Though the Simulacra's dystopia is in the top 10 on the list, it might already sound familiar to you, since it's actually started from our 28th worst dystopia in the novella Novelty Act, and then was later expanded by Dick into a full novel. Unfortunately for the characters in the Simulacra, the extra content in this novel is only going to make things harder on them than their Novelty Act counterparts. Like in Novelty Act and many of our other stories, the world is characterized by authoritarian rule, corporate manipulation, and a fabricated reality controlled by those in power. Set in the late 21st century, the US, which is now called the United States of Europe and America, or the USEA, operates under a totalitarian government where seemingly eternal First Lady, Nicole Thibodeau, rules while a series of puppet presidents are installed and removed at will. However, even Nicole herself is a simulacrum, an artificial construct designed to maintain the illusion of continuity and control. One of the most striking elements of this world is the widespread use of simulacra, or lifelike androids that serve various roles from political figures to everyday laborers, blurring the line between human and machine. Society is also marked with rigid class divisions, with the elite living in luxury while the lower classes struggle with economic instability and government oppression. Meanwhile, access to space travel and psychotropic drugs provide a fake sense of escape, further reinforcing the regime's control. Number 8. The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. In Three Stigmata, Earth has passed the point of no return with climate change, with most of the world being uninhabitable without specialized equipment, and Antarctica being a popular vacation destination. The solution to this was to expand humanity to all habitable planets in the solar system. This isn't the Jetsons though, and while life on Earth is no longer easy and getting more difficult by the day, life on the extraplanetary colonies is even worse. Quality of life is low, people have little space, few resources, and almost no luxuries. To deal with these hardships, the colonists have resorted to an increased dependence on drugs and escapism in the form of the drug Can-D, a powerful hallucinogen. Along with Can-D, users buy cardboard layouts that allow them to create and guide their hallucinations, sharing the experience of the main character in the hallucinated universe, Perky Pat. This ability to share hallucinations with others has spawned a series of small religious cults around it as well. One company, called Perky Pat Layouts, holds a monopoly over these products, both the layouts as well as the Can-D drug itself. Entire businesses are built around selling products to PP Layouts as accessories for their layouts, and entire communities revolve around this escapism. This is another instance of a PKD dystopian short story later expanded into even more expansive world building in a later novel, with Three Stigmata being spawned from an earlier short story with an even more bleak life for its characters that we'll talk about a little later in this ranking, The Days of Perky Pat. Number 7. The Man in the High Castle. Being one of Dick's most famous novels and a story that lends itself to a successful TV show, The Man in the High Castle hardly needs a long introduction, but I'm going to give it anyway. The world is a mirror to our own, with one significant difference. World War II was won by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The change hinges on a single moment in history, an assassination plot by Giuseppe Zangara to kill Franklin Roosevelt right before he was officially inaugurated as president. In our actual timeline, Zangara was able to take 5 shots at Roosevelt with his handgun, though he missed every shot, accidentally killing the mayor of Chicago instead. In Man in the High Castle, however, the assassination attempt was successful and Roosevelt was struck down. Without his guidance and the New Deal, the US was unable to pull out of the Great Depression, therefore never ending their isolationist stance on world politics. This hesitancy to enter the war allowed Germany to easily take Europe, and by the time the US was willing to join the fight, the Nazis had already become too powerful. The story is set in the US after it was split down the middle by the two victors, with Japan getting the Pacific side of the US and Germany getting the Atlantic, with a small neutral zone in between. The Nazis have been successful in some ways in the decade and a half since the war ended, establishing colonies on the Moon, Venus, and Mars, establishing rocket-powered flight, making transcontinental travel only take the matter of a couple hours, and draining the Mediterranean Sea in order to create more landmass and farmland for themselves. Though, as you would expect from a Nazi-dominated world, socially humanity is devastated. The Western Japanese-controlled US has enslaved their black population and reduced the Chinese Americans to second-class citizens, stripping away many of their rights. As the book begins, a schism is beginning to form in the Nazi and Japanese leadership due to Hitler falling ill with syphilis, as the high-ranking Nazis begin to position themselves to take over as Germany's chancellor when Hitler dies. One glimmer of hope does exist, though, in the form of the titular Man in the High Castle, who is an author named Hawthorne Amundsen, who wrote the novel titled The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. This book, which is supposed fiction, suggests a world where Germany and Japan lost the war. Though the Nazis have banned the book, the Japanese do allow its publication on their half of the states. Amundsen is said to live in his high castle, an estate that hopes to hide and protect him from assassination attempts that may come from those who aren't so fond of his suggestions. Though the story doesn't sit on top of our list due to the existence of global civilization and basic necessities, it is certainly a nightmare scenario that can only be topped by the most nihilistic wastelands that exist from here on out. Number 6. Flow my tears, the policeman said. We only get more depressing from here. In an alternate timeline in 1988, the US has just made it out of a second civil war, which only ended when the police and National Guard cooperated to install a military dictatorship, complete with a dictator at the top known as the Director. The country is devastated socially, with the African American population being completely wiped out, the age of consent being lowered to 12, recreational drug use being common, and genetically engineered humans known as sixes are considered the elite of society. The last bastion of resistance is isolated to students on college campuses who are more and more needing to hide underground in small communities in order to escape authorities. Number 5. The Ganymede Takeover. Another example of PKD working with another author on a story, The Ganymede Takeover is a dive into the subjugation of the human race by worm-like aliens who use a slave race called creatures to help them interact with the world. Humanity is on its last bit of resistance as the Ganymedians finalize their conquering of the human race, with the last bastion of human freedom holed up somewhere in Tennessee. Elsewhere, human puppet rulers exchange their loyalty to their species for small bits of power and a less oppressive form of slavery. As is typical of a PKD story, this one also involves telepaths and precogs, and small glimmers of hope for humanity exist in various premonitions about the small resistance that's still around. There is more hope here than the other top 5 on the list, but humanity getting conquered and subjugated by aliens is certainly enough to put the Ganymede Takeover high on the list. Number 4. Deus Irae. One of the few stories on this list not entirely written by PKD, Deus Irae has an interesting story behind it. The book was shelved unfinished as Dick didn't think he had the theological knowledge to finish it in the way he really wanted. He gave what he had to author Ted White in order to collaborate, but White let the manuscript sit without doing any real work on it. Another author, Roger Zelazny, found the copy at White's house and told Dick that he was interested in working on it with him. Dick agreed, but even after that both authors would only work on it sporadically, many times forgetting about it entirely, to the point where Zelazny's cat peed on the manuscript without him really noticing. Eventually the publisher asked for either the advance back or the original manuscript, and Zelazny was forced to send the stained pages and hope for the best. Luckily for us, the novel was finished and achieves a place in the top 10 of our list. Though the story is thought-provoking, it really isn't the most original PKD setting and is in many ways a classic post-apocalyptic setting, complete with wiped-out technology, war cults, mutated animals, and a general feeling of nihilism and hopelessness. That said, originality isn't a huge part of the criteria for this list, and it's more than made up for by the sheer brutality of the world. Living in the wake of a nuclear apocalypse, radiation has permanently changed the environment, devastating plant life and mutating both animals and humans. Major religions are almost completely wiped out by the Servants of Wrath, a new religion that worships Carlton Luftwaffe, the man who created and detonated the bombs that wiped out the world as we know it. Communication outside of local areas is largely non-existent. This is one of the most difficult places to live in all of PKD's stories. Number 3. The Days of Perky Pat. The Days of Perky Pat is a bleak short story that looks at humans' reaction to major trauma. Much like Deus Irae, Perky Pat follows a devastating nuclear war that leaves humans huddled in small communities, desperately trying to live off the burned-up wastelands. In order to cope with the loss of everything they ever knew, the citizens begin to rely on escapism through a role-playing game using a doll called Perky Pat, which is definitely comparable to the layouts and Perky Pat from the novel that spawned from this one, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. Despite just barely scratching out a living, people still prioritize dumping resources into their shared delusion over improving their actual lives. While this short story's world building is less interesting and original than Three Stigmata, the world itself is in a much more devastated state with less resources and less hope for the future compared to the novel it expanded into. For those reasons, Three Stigmata is edged out by its predecessor for the number 3 spot on the list. Number 2. Second Variety. In another example of Dick's post-nuclear apocalypse settings, Second Variety is set right after a nuclear war between Russia and the United Nations that wipes out most of the world's surface. The UN is forced to set up a base on the moon after being beaten back early in the war, but then managed to develop self-regulating robots to fight in place of their troops. These robots, nicknamed Claws, are completely hands-off in every way, including their production, being developed in underground factories that are completely automated. The robots attack Soviet forces, opening up and revealing a series of spinning blades, chasing and attacking its prey at a staggeringly fast pace. The automated factories are able to pump out new Claws constantly and completely overwhelm the Russians. In a matter of years, the Claws have completely turned the tide of the war. But what is the UN actually left with? A devastated Earth's surface dotted with self-replicating robotic weapons that are now completely outside of their control. Though the war is won, it's hard to imagine what the spoils are that are actually going to the victor. Number 1. The story to end all stories for Harlan Ellison's anthology, Dangerous Visions. The top entry on this list, and the most devastating PKD dystopia, absolutely has to go to the story to end all stories for Harlan Ellison's anthology, Dangerous Visions. Not only is this the worst, but it's also the shortest story, and definitely the most bizarre. More of a writing exercise than it is an actual story, this 117-word piece of literature tells of a grotesque world in the wake of a hydrogen bomb apocalypse. Due to its short length, it's hard to talk about the story without describing it in full, and I'm not sure how descriptive of it I can be on YouTube anyways, but it does involve a zoo where humans, aliens, and mutants have sexual relations with each other, and a deformed woman fights an alien woman for a baby for the purpose of cannibalism. Since the subject itself is so short, I'm just going to leave its description there. I don't think I need to convince anyone why this deserves the top spot on the list. Thank you so much for listening to the whole list. This is definitely an extremely subjective list that's full of subjective opinions, so if you don't agree with any of my rankings or if I got anything incorrect, please leave a comment and I'll make sure to add a note in the description. If you enjoyed this video, I would very much appreciate a like and subscribe. I love talking about my favorite stories, so if that interests you, please take a look at some of my other videos. Have a great day.